So hi, my name is Paddy Hirsch. I'm a senior editor at Marketplace. We've been trying to come up with metaphors that can explain simply and easily what's going on with this credit crisis right now. And I've been working with one for a while that I think is fairly illustrative. It's called the credit crisis as Antarctic expedition. Let me explain. Firstly, here we have the Antarctic, a bare waste of ice, and on the Antarctic ice face, we have a number of mountaineers, or a number of expeditioneers, I should say. Each of these is burdened, as expeditioneers are, by large rucksacks, which are carrying all of the vital things that they need to survive. And in the bank's case, let's think of these as banks or as financial institutions. That means bonds, loans, securities, etc., etc. That's what allows them to do business. That's what allows them to make money. And as these gentlemen, or these institutions, these people, move across the ice, occasionally they'll come across a crevasse. And when they come across a crevasse, usually they can just hop across. You know, if they've got too much weight, they can trade some of the weight between them. You know, somebody else can take some of the weight and allow the next man or the next person, the next institution to get across that problem, at which point they can load back up again and carry on as before. But recently, these institutions have been putting more weight on. Over the last few years, they've been loading up on these very rich instruments called mortgage-backed securities, or CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and so it's put a lot more pressure on them, a lot more weight on them. So when they come up to any problems, they're much more likely to have problems getting across getting across those issues. And in some cases, in the Lehman Brothers case in particular, they have actually fallen in. So here we have Lehman Brothers, this rucksack, falling into the abyss. Now, on any normal day, this wouldn't be so much of a problem. Of course, it's bad news to lose a member of the expedition, but the fact is that banks are very competitive, and it's every man for himself when you're on the ice shelf. But unfortunately, Lehman Brothers is not alone. It's not unencumbered. It is in fact linked together with all the rest of these institutions. Now, if you're thinking about the expedition, all of these people are roped up together. They're all bound together by ropes that are attached to their harnesses, which is a smart thing to do, because if you fall in, it allows your friends to drag you out, or it makes it less likely that you're actually going to disappear down the crevasse. This rope in the financial services term is called the credit default swap system, and it has bound all of these institutions together. So firstly, they're firmly linked. Secondly, they're very comprehensively linked. And it's very, very difficult to get these credit default swaps undone. It's very difficult to get yourself out of the system. So when Lehman Brothers plunged into the abyss, all of these other banks, all of these other institutions find themselves being dragged along. Now, once again, if they hadn't been encumbered by these mortgage-backed securities, by these CDS, if they weren't so heavily laden and so top-heavy and unstable, then they might be able to hold themselves up. But they're finding that as Lehman goes down, they're being dragged closer and closer and closer towards the edge of the abyss. And panic sets in. They're trying to undo the credit default swaps. What they could do is they could transfer some of the weight to each other. Maybe someone who had a little less weight could buy some of the assets from someone who had too much weight, so that you could transfer some of the risk. But the banks aren't doing it. They don't trust anybody. They're doing their best to hold on to all the good stuff that they have, which is the cash. They won't take any bad stuff from anyone else. They won't take any risks at all. And the result is that they're just sitting there on the ice, freezing. The weather's getting bad, and there's a real likelihood that in these conditions, these expeditioneers will die, or in the financial services terms, the banks will fail, the financial institutions will fail. Now, quite recently, the drag down by Lehman Brothers nearly pulled a second institution into the abyss with it, AIG. AIG, an enormous company, heavily laden with credit default swaps, was teetering on the edge. But it was decided that AIG should not be allowed to fail. It's still teetering there. We're still having problems, working out how it's going to cover its debts, how it's going to cover itself, how it's going to survive. But fortunately, there is a solution, a rescue plan, in the shape of Henry's Helo Rescue. All right. So Henry flies in on his helicopter, Henry Paulson, and he has a plan to rescue these expeditioneers. And it can basically work one of two ways. Firstly, he could pick up all the expeditioners, fish the broken bones of Lehman Brothers out of the hole, put them all on the helicopter, and fly them back to the hospital. But that's very expensive for a start, and banks do not want to. I mean, the reason that they're so successful is because they don't like to spend money unwisely, and they think that they can get a better deal. So they don't want to do that. They don't want the government to buy them all out and to take them over and to look after them as though they were casualties without any hope of savior. So Henry came up with a second plan, which is he will land, and he says he will buy all the stuff, all the equipment in these expeditioners' rucksacks that they don't want. In other words, he will buy all the assets in the bank's portfolios that they don't want and load them onto his helicopters. Now the banks love the sound of this. Firstly, if there's less weight on them, then they're less top-heavy, less unstable, and it's easier for them to maneuver, even though they're still tied together. It makes it easier for them to get around. And secondly, they're going to they don't have to just leave this stuff on the ice. They're actually going to be able to sell it to somebody who's going to take it away. So, and with all of these mortgage-backed securities out of the way, they're now much less encumbered, much more maneuverable, and able to continue on the expedition. And as time goes on, they will be able to unravel this rope that has tied them up with Lehman Brothers. And once they get rid of that particular burden, then they'll be able to swan on as if nothing had happened. What does this mean for Henry? Well, he's taking on all of these so-called toxic assets. Well, they're not necessarily that toxic. I mean, when the banks first bought them, they paid a pretty penny for them, which is why they want to be compensated if Henry's going to be taking them off their hands. So Henry's going to load his helicopter up with all of these things that these banks don't want, and he's going to take them back to base camp. Now, it's costing him a pretty penny, and he's found that he's actually had to maybe raid his company's payroll in order to raise the money to pay for all these securities, these things that the expeditioners don't want. But he knows two things. Firstly, while some of this excess baggage is not worth anything at all, a great deal of it is going to be worth quite a lot of money in the future, particularly because he's buying it at a very deep discount to what these guys paid. He knows he can, if he manages to get back to base camp, he can sell it to other people who happen to be expeditioners, Japanese climbers, for example, or people from Brazil. He also knows that these bankers have a very short memory, so when they get back to base camp, he may even be able to sell those assets back to them. That's how short a memory these guys have. Of course, Henry's problem is that he's only got one helicopter. He's got to get all this stuff back. His wife isn't going to be too pleased when he gets back and she sees what's in the helicopter. And of course, gas is very expensive, so this is not going to be a cheap process. There's a lot of risk involved, but he believes it could pan out in the end. But what's absolutely certain is, when everybody does get back to base camp, whether they're safe and sound or not, if anybody else falls into crevasses or not, if Henry manages to make money from his deal, everyone is going to need a drink.